So here's what they should say why President Andrew Jackson, the seventh president of the United States, was bumped to the backside of the $20 bill. He was moved to the back of the 20 because he thought that paying off the national debt, which he did, was a good idea. In 1828, the year before President Jackson took office, there was a federal government budget deficit, which increased the national debt to $67 million. So what does that mean? The federal government spent more than it received that year. It means the federal government lost money. That's the part everybody gets. But what else happened in 1828? The non-federal government, which are the households and the businesses, plus the local and state governments, aka the private sector, they gained those federal government dollars. So in 1828, or in any year with a federal government budget deficit, yes, the federal government has a dollar drain, but the private sector has a dollar add. That's the part nobody gets. In 1829, this all flips over. In President Jackson's first year in office, there was a large federal government budget surplus, which decreased the national debt to $58 million. So what does that mean? It means the federal government received more than it spent that year. It means the federal government made money that year. But again, what else happened? The non-federal government, again, those households and businesses plus state and local governments that make up the non-federal government, didn't receive those federal government dollars. So the non-federal government lost money. Or in other words, in 1829, the federal government had a dollar add and the private sector had a dollar drain. That federal government surplus in 1829 was a private sector deficit to the penny, and exactly to the penny, and we know that for sure because there was no net currency flow in or out of the US that year. In 1829, the same amount of money that went overseas to pay for imports equaled the amount of money that came in from our sale of exports. So since the federal government had a $0 trade balance, which is that all-important third sector of this dollar flow equilibrium we are talking about here, it makes it very easy to picture the dollar flows that year because all flows remained within only the government and the private sector. All net flow was domestic. How do you picture these dollar flows in 1829? The same way you picture a seesaw. When one child on the seesaw goes up, the other child goes down. And by how much? By the exact amount. Every credit is an equal and opposite debit. That is simple accounting identity. The same goes for 1829. For every dollar of federal government surplus, that credit into the government, there has to be an exact amount of deficit or debit out from the private sector. Now, of course, if there was a trade and or capital surplus or deficit in 1829, that international flow, that would be like a third child jumping on one of either sides of this seesaw. And all three sectors combined, they all equal zero, meaning all three sectors, government flow, private flow, and overseas flow, all counterbalance. So the bottom line is that for any one sector to run a surplus, another sector or sectors must run a deficit by the same exact amount. If you understand this, then you are in a very small group. Unfortunately, today, most politicians, our fiscal policymakers, are not in this group, and neither was President Jackson. Before becoming president, Andrew Jackson was a war hero, and before that he ran a very profitable cotton plantation in Tennessee, and that fiscal discipline would have also served him well in the local and state level of government. But on the federal government level, which is a different paradigm from the non-federal government level, President Andrew Jackson's fiscal discipline doomed the U.S. economy. These dollar drains of economic oxygen out from the private sector suffocated that private sector. This money supply collapse, this red ink, these private sector deficits, these are the deficits that are unsustainable. To pay off and slay that national debt in 1835, President Jackson ran these budget surpluses, meaning he replaced prolonged public sector deficits with these prolonged private sector deficits. And the result? The Panic of 1837. The U.S. economy went into a depression, banks became insolvent, business failures rose, cotton prices dropped, and unemployment dramatically increased, a depression that lasted for 4 years, until 1841, when the national debt went back to increasing again, meaning sustained private sector deficits switched back to private sector surpluses, which ended that depression, and the economy began to rebound. Not convinced? Look at these dates. These dates were the 6 periods in American history when the U.S. federal government had substantial yearly budget surpluses, which decreased total U.S. federal government debt, meaning at the very same time and by accounting identity, the private sector was being subjected to deficits. Next, look at these dates. These dates were the starting years of all 6 economic depressions in U.S. history. Now let's put the dates together. Each of these examples, every sustained federal government spending surplus, and at the very same time, there was a sustained private sector savings deficit with the same results. Coincidence? Here's another example of federal government surpluses having its fingerprints on economic downturns. The 2001 recession was also preceded by federal government budget surpluses. The Bush recession was triggered by the Clinton surpluses. In my opinion, however, the economy was very strong during Clinton's second term, so in that particular case, those short-lived surpluses were timely. They were analogous to tapping the brakes on the economy very slightly. And masterfully, that 2001 recession was a mild one because Clinton's successor, incoming President George W. Bush, with both the Congress and Fed Chair Alan Greenspan's blessings, quickly resumed federal budget deficits with tax cuts, a rare example of both monetary and fiscal policymakers being in sync and turning their launch keys at the same time. Alexander Hamilton, the first U.S. Secretary of the Treasury, who, it was also announced, will remain on the front of the $10 bill, said in 1790, "A national debt, if it is not excessive, will be to us a national blessing." He never said anything about paying it off. In fact, Hamilton argued for the usefulness of safe, easily traded federal debt that would provide a store of value, serve as a lubricant for further business activity, making the economy more productive, which he predicted would help our new nation someday surpass England as a world power. In conclusion, unless you truly need to slam the brakes on economic growth, and you actually want to slow down the velocity of those $20 bills, sustained and prolonged federal government surpluses, or paying off the national debt, or a spending sequestration, or a federal government balanced budget provision, all these, thought to be necessary by the collective groupthink, are glaring examples of fiscal policymaking blunders and why that dangerous narrative that the federal government is the same as a household has it all backwards. Thanks for listening.